In this video, I will explain the argument against belief in God from the idea that the believer has the whole burden of proof. I hope to show conclusively, or almost conclusively, that this argument is a bad one, and that it is eminently rational to believe that the theist, the God believer, is on the same footing as the atheist, the one that denies the existence of God. The burden of proof is evenly divided among those who affirm versus those who deny the existence of God. It seems that a lot of atheists view this argument as something of a trump card, that the atheist can pull out his sleeve when the debate has reached a stalemate. I believe that triumphalism in this case is totally unwarranted. It is not motivated by a good argument, but probably, maybe, more by pride or sloppy thinking or a combination of both. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself now though. First, what is the argument from the burden of proof? Well, the person who has the burden of proof in a discussion is under the rational demand to prove his point. And if he fails doing that, he will lose the discussion by default. Then the opponent will win the discussion by walkover. In most discussions, we assume that both parties have to prove their point, and that no one can win by walkover, right? But there are situations where we will accept a tilted or uneven division of the burden of proof. The courtroom is the best example. The attorney has the burden of proof to prove guilt, and the defense lawyer has no burden to prove innocence. The only burden he has is to show that the attorney fails to prove guilt. It's like laying penalty kicks in soccer. The penalty kicker has to score in order to win. And the other one, the goalie, just have to save the ball. He doesn't have to kick the ball in the opposite goal in order to win, right? The goalie will win by default if the penalty kicker misses the goal. Now, a common atheist argument goes like this. The theist, the God believer, has to score a goal, and the atheist just has to save the ball from going into the net. And if he saves the ball, he will win the game. Now, here's a very important question. Why would any discussion or case or situation whatsoever be such that it warrants an uneven burden of proof? I mean, we don't usually say things like this. I disagree with you, and now you have to prove your point. And if you fail to do that, my position will win automatically. I don't need to give any good arguments for my position. Your failure is the only argument I need to prove my point. I mean, anyone who on a regular basis says things like that would be considered crazy, right? Why? Because any tilting of the burden of proof needs at least one strong and accepted reason for tilting it. But that means that the person who claims that the whole burden of proof is tilted to his or her advantage has the burden of proof to show that. I can speak of a second grade burden of proof here to show that the burden of proof should be tilted in the first place. But that means that the atheist who claims an uneven burden of proof to the disadvantage of the theist has the burden of proof to prove this. And that proof has to consist of a really good and acceptable reason. So, such a reason that both sides can agree and that both sides can start playing. That means arguing, right? But what are those arguments? Remember, those reasons have to be so convincing that both parties agree that they justify this uneven burden of proof. Because if those reasons are not strong enough, they need to be part of the first discussion and cannot be part of a newly settled discussion, right? Simply because it's not settled. So, what are those reasons? Has the atheist been successful enough to meet the burden of proof concerning his claim that the theist has the whole burden of proof when it comes to the question of the existence of God? There are usually two arguments that atheists come up with. The first is this: if you claim that something exists, you have the burden of proof, but if you claim that something does not exist, you have no burden of proof. Usually this claim is illustrated in some funny or eccentric way. For instance, the Loch Ness Monster, the snowman, or a teapot somewhere in space or something like that. If you claim that the Loch Ness Monster exists, you have the full burden of proof. But you don't have to prove the non-existence of the monster in order to be justified in not believing in the monster, right? Observe that this is an exception to the common rule that says absence of proof is not proof of absence. But in this case, weird and eccentric cases, we actually count absence of proof as proof of absence. Later, we will ask why that is the case. But first, let's briefly look at this argument. Is it true that the existence statement needs proofs and non-existence statements doesn't? Well, it seems not. If we just change the Loch Ness Monster to fish, the situation is turned upside down. If I make the existence claim that there are fish in the Loch Ness Lake, it seems that I don't really need to prove my point as much as the person who claims the opposite, that there are no fish in the Loch Ness Lake. Why is that? Because the second claim is more surprising than the first. In lakes the size of the Loch Ness, there are usually fishes. So the person that denies this by giving a non-existence claim is the one who needs to justify his claim. And if he fails to do that, we seem to be justified in believing that there are fish in Loch Ness, solely from the background knowledge we have entering into the discussion that there usually are fishes in a lake of that size. In other words, it is not whether the claim is an existence claim, a positive claim, or a negative, non-existence claim that will determine whether you get the burden of proof. It's rather if the claim is surprising. It's the most surprising claim, given the background knowledge we have entering the discussion, that has the burden of proof, right? So that leaves us with the question, is it more surprising to ask whether God exists or whether God does not exist? Well, that suddenly is a much more difficult question to answer in any neutral way, right? The theist might argue that the non-existence of God is much more surprising given the existence of design in the universe, the human experience of morality, or something that speaks to us that seems to be objective and authoritative, and so on. An atheist might argue that the existence of God is more surprising given the existence of evil and so on. But how to weigh all these is really difficult. You can't do that in a neutral way. Instead, it actually has to be part of the original discussion and should not give us any cause to tilt the very discussion by giving one side the whole burden of proof. The second argument atheists use to prove that the burden of proof should be tilted is the expression that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proofs, together with the idea that God's existence is extraordinary. Until and unless extraordinary proofs are given, we should therefore not believe in God, rationally speaking. Is this a good and convincing argument? Let's see. What is extraordinary, by the way? Isn't it almost exactly the same as surprising, which is those things that sticks out from the ordinary? But is it more extraordinary that God exists, or more extraordinary that God doesn't exist? Given our experience of reason as something more than just a late-coming evolutionary product geared only towards survival and not truth or rationality per se, is God really that extraordinary? It seems again, that the atheist is begging the question by saying that God's existence is more extraordinary or strange or surprising given our background knowledge compared to God's non-existence. But isn't that just to assume the very atheist outlook of life that the atheist has to defend and not just take for granted? And furthermore, what gives the atheist the right to believe that the theist has the rational obligation to take the atheist outlook, or what seems most surprising, for granted? Isn't that really to beg the question, or rather to demand that your opponent should, so to speak, beg your question into his view? It seems then that the atheist has failed to carry the burden of proof to show that the theist has the burden of proof in the God debate. And if so, the whole thing will collapse to the original position where both parties have an equally divided burden of proof, meaning that each and everyone has to give good arguments for his or her position. And no one can just sit back and think that they can win by default. There is no room for such a lazy and comfortable attitude in this discussion. Not for the theist and not for the atheist.